Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to be unpacking one of the most profound and honestly fascinating concepts found in ancient texts and modern theology, inner spiritual transformation. We hear the word transformation thrown around constantly these days, right? From self-help books to corporate rebrands. But the historical and biblical roots of this idea point to something much, much deeper than just a simple change of habits. We're actually looking at a fundamental shift of human nature itself.
To really wrap our heads around this, we've got to look at the language. In German texts, like the famous Luther Bibel, this concept is often just translated as transform or renew. But the original Greek root, that gives us the word metamorpho. So this isn't just about, slapping on a fresh coat of paint. This word implies a deep, almost biological level shift. It's a fundamental change of a person's inner nature that eventually and inevitably becomes totally visible on the outside.
So how exactly does that whole process work? Well, here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll ask, what is spiritual metamorphosis? Second, we'll examine the three biblical pillars. Third, myth versus biblical reality. Fourth, we'll look at it as a steady inner process. And finally, the practical theological impacts. Let's get right into this inside-out journey.
Section 1. What is spiritual metamorphosis? The foundation of an inside-out transformation.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the biological parallel. Christian theology basically views this process as an organic alteration of human nature by the Spirit of God. Think about it like a caterpillar completely dissolving and rebuilding itself to become a butterfly. This spiritual transformation isn't just some quick behavior modification, it's an internal reshaping that completely alters the outer reality of the individual. Literally, a change from a strictly material state of being into a highly spiritual one.
Moving right along to Section 2, the three biblical pillars. 4 verses, 3 distinct facets of change. The New Testament actually only uses our Greek keyword, metamorpho, in 4 specific places, which construct these 3 pillars.
The first pillar focuses entirely on the mind. Over in the book of Romans, chapter 12, verse 2, the Apostle Paul issues a pretty massive challenge. He urges believers not to conform to the standards and patterns of the world, but rather to be transformed by the renewing of your mind.
So the crucial point is that this is not a passive experience where you just sit back and let it happen. It's a very active, ongoing redesign of human thinking. The text basically describes the Spirit of God coming in and completely remodeling a person's internal operating system. We're talking about their priorities, their thought patterns, and the very posture of their heart, completely redesigned from the inside out.
Let's move to and see how this builds into our second pillar, which shifts the focus from the mind to the ultimate image. 2 Corinthians 3:18 states that believers are transformed into the same image from glory to glory.
Right here is where we see the ultimate spiritual goal of all this metamorphosis, Christ-likeness. And our sources make it abundantly clear that this is definitely not some one-time overnight magical event. No, it's organic growth over a lifetime. The idea is that the more a person aligns their life with God, the more their daily life will naturally start to reflect divine character traits, specifically things like love, patience, and peace.
Then we have the third and final biblical pillar, which we might call the divine preview. The last 2 uses of our Greek keyword pop up in Matthew 17:2 and Mark 9:2. Both of these describe a very specific historical event, the transfiguration of Jesus up on a mountain, where his appearance physically transformed and literally shone like the sun. The theological significance here? It's that the inner divine glory briefly broke outward. It effectively lifted that veil, that separation between the earthly and the heavenly realms. All right, on to Section 3, myth versus biblical reality. Let's contrast some ancient worldviews on transformation. And this brilliantly illustrates the stark contrast when we look at the broader historical context. On the left side here, we have ancient mythology. Think of the Roman poet Ovid, for example. In those myths, the gods transformed humans into animals or stones totally arbitrarily. It was usually used as a punishment, driven purely by the whims and willpower of the divine. But on the right, we have the biblical model. The source text describe this metamorphosis as deeply relational, healing, and liberating. It's not a punishment at all, it's a synergy. Much like the concept of rebirth in John 3:3, it requires a cooperative interaction between human faith and the power of the Holy Spirit. Which brings us to Section 4, a steady inner process. Let's look at the actual timeline of spiritual evolution. According to the theological sources we're examining, this whole process unfolds in 4 very distinct phases. It kicks off with phase 1, faith, which acts as the initial catalyst. That naturally leads into phase 2, rebirth, marking the actual beginning of the inner change. Then we hit phase 3, which is sonship. This is where the individual really starts aligning their values and beliefs with the teachings of Jesus, moving away from manipulative behaviors and leaning way more on divine reliance. And finally, this matures into phase 4, joined inheritance. This represents a full, shared spiritual connection and destiny. It's an amazing, step-by-step evolution of a person's character.
Finally, Section 5, Practical Theological Impacts. Let's see how this inner theology actually impacts the outer world.
Let's look objectively at how this gets interpreted across a couple of major traditions. On the left, in Protestantism, like you'd see outlined in documents like the Second Helvetic Confession, this transformation is often called regeneration. The emphasis here is heavily placed on the Holy Spirit illuminating human understanding. Meanwhile, over on the Catholic side to the right, thinkers like Jacques Maritain describe this metamorphosis as a profound renewal of the deep inner energies of the human conscience. But notice, both traditions view it as an internal engine that fundamentally drives external morality.
And that external morality has some very practical, real-world applications. Our sources highlight 3 key areas. First up is diaconia, or charitable service. This is viewed not just as social work, but as a deeply spiritual act where you're actually encountering love and a higher good. Second is the fight against systemic issues like racism. The sources argue that overcoming deep, ingrained societal conditioning inherently requires a profound spiritual transformation of the individual. You have to change from the inside out to fight it. And finally, we see this in the methods of writers like Henry Nouwen, who explored this journey toward spiritual wholeness through the lens of mystical traditions. Across the board, changing one's inner nature is presented as the absolute prerequisite for adopting a truly moral lifestyle. So we've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored the ancient Greek roots, those 3 biblical pillars, the stark contrast with ancient myths, and some highly modern ethical applications. But all of this source material ultimately turns the lens right back around to the individual. It leaves us with this incredibly compelling, highly practical question to consider. How does this inner transformation actually show itself in everyday life today? Seriously, take a moment and think about that as you reflect on what we've covered. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.